Well, hello, everyone. I am pumped today to be talking with Karen Walrond, who has made such an impact in my own life over the last couple of years. And Karen, you have a book coming out, and I am so excited to share this with the world. So first of all, thanks for being with me today.
Oh my God, what a thrill. It's so good to see your face. So this is really, really exciting for me.
Me too. I'm just like, I can't stop smiling. I'm so excited. So I would love to start out and just have you share your story. Like what brought you to where you are today? Before we jump into the book and all of that, I would love to hear a bit about your story.
Wow. Well, it's a very long and convoluted story. I don't know how far back you want me to start, but so I was born in the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and live here in Houston, of course, as you. And my background is actually in engineering and law.
Mhm.
And I was working in the energy industry for a very long time. And then finally, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version here, but eventually when I became a young parent, I stopped practicing law and decided I wanted to work for myself. And I didn't really know what it was that I wanted to do, but I knew that I had some passions around photography and around public speaking and around writing. And so ended up really doing that. And I wrote a book and I had this blog and I was doing a lot of public speaking. And then around the same time that all of that was happening, I met Brene Brown, who
Wait, who's that again? No,
yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I never know, right? Like Brene is one of my really dear friends, and I never know when I talk to people because people are either, oh my God, Brene Brown, or they're like, yeah, I'm not familiar, right? Like it's always sort of one or the other. But for those who aren't familiar, she is a researcher and a multiple New York Times bestselling author from Houston. She studies shame and vulnerability and courage and empathy. And we became friends just coincidentally, sort of through other friends. And she knew I was doing a lot of public speaking and she was on sort of her rise and invited me to get certified in her work. And so I did and met a lot of people who I were leadership coaches and I really didn't know what that was. Mm-hmm. So sort of listening to them and realizing, what they did and how they helped, executives and entrepreneurs sort of maximize their own productivity and their own joy and happiness in their work. I thought this sounds like something I could really do. So I went and got a bit of training in that. And which is sort of how we met, is I started coaching. And then just wrote a new book, which is the one that's just coming out right now. So that was sort of a speed train, bullet train through kind of.
Well done. That was so good. Yes, exactly. Well, that's one of the things that I love about you is you have such diverse experiences in your career so far. And that's what makes you so good at what you do. Every single time you just kind of pivot a little bit, it all builds to make you even better at the next thing you're doing, whether it's writing a book or coaching. And yes, that's how we met. So a mutual friend of ours who was helping you with your coaching organization said, hey, you've really got to check this out. This coaching group that Karen's doing, it's called the Star Collective. And I looked into it and was like, oh my gosh, this would be transformational for me, because I found myself, about 10 years, and this was about a year and a half ago, I guess, when we started working together. I was about 10 years into my career and I could rattle off all the mission statements and values of the company I was working for because I loved my job and I found so much identity in that. But I realized I can't tell you what Holly Tate's values or mission statement is, or
oh wow, yeah.
And that's exactly what you helped me unpack through this beautiful group of women that, I mean, we spanned like 5 decades, I think, Karen, like that group of 12 women.
It was amazing. It was a very intimate, very diverse group of people, which was fantastic. Yeah.
It really was.
And I'm so grateful to all of you for what you've done and how much you help and how much you impacted actually this book that I wrote. Like I couldn't have done it without you guys. It was a really, really great experience for me as well.
Well, it was phenomenal, and still keep in touch with several of the women in that group. And it's just so neat to, I wouldn't have started my company or have the job that I have now if it wasn't for going through that coaching experience with you. So I'm so grateful.
Nice.
Okay, so what you just said there was, really impacted a lot of this book. So tell me about the Lightmaker's Manifesto. Guys, look how beautiful this cover is.
It sparkles.
It's gorgeous.
It sparkles. I just love look at sparkles. Sparkle.
I know. It's so awesome. And okay, let's just take a second. I mean, speaking of Brene Brown, like literally at the top it says, Karen Walrond shines her light so we can find our own. And I have experienced that firsthand. I know Brene has as well, but what led you to have the idea for this book?
It's so funny because people ask me that a lot, and I have to always admit up front, it wasn't my idea. Like it wasn't my choice. I was just going along my merry way, and a publisher contacted me. So I had written a book. It's almost 10 years earlier, and I'm a photographer, so it was sort of a photo book, and called The Beauty of Different, Observations of a Confident Misfit was the name of that book. And it was fine, and it did well, and it led to other writings, and it led to a lot of really great things that happened in my life. And one of those things was I was invited to contribute an essay to another book. And my publisher had a copy of that book. That book's called Disquiet Time. And she signed up for my newsletter and sort of was following my blog. And on, I think it was January 2nd, 2020, she emailed me. So like at the beginning of a year, and she emailed me and she said, hi, I'm with Broadleaf Books, and we are looking for a book on the intersection of joy and activism. And I think you could write it. Now, normally I would have totally ignored that email. Like I would have just been like, okay, I don't know who you are. Well, I just, I've been blogging for a while, and I was just like, I've never heard of this publisher, and I have no clue who you are. And no, like I just would have hit delete. But she caught me at a good year, because I had just chosen the words bold and experiment for my year. And so I thought, well, if these are my words, I am going to follow this up. So I emailed her back and I said, I'm intrigued, let's meet. And so we met, and she says, this is what I'm looking for. I've read your newsletters, and I think you could do this. And I said, because bold and experiment, I said, yeah, sure, totally could do this. Like, yeah, who else? And then hung up the Zoom, right? And thought, I can't do this. Like, what? This is ridiculous that she would think I'm qualified to write anything about joy and activism. I do write a lot about joy and gratitude, but activism, like, I'm not an activist. This is me thinking at the time, right? I'm not an activist. Activists are people who stand in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square, and there are people who like get tear gassed, and people who get arrested and beaten, have fire hoses turned on them. Like, those are activists. I am not an activist. I mean, I've done a pride parade every once in a while, and I've done a couple of other things, but that's sort of it. And sort of, thought, okay, well, I've just told this woman I'm going to go ahead and put together a book proposal for her. So what could I do? Like, and my first thought was, well, my first book, I'd interviewed a lot of people, and I really loved that process. So I thought, well, let me think of who the activists are in my life, who I could interview. And so Brene was the first person I thought of, because we really are very good friends, and she does a lot of anti-discrimination work. So I thought, okay, that's great. And then Tarana Burke, who founded the Me Too movement, is also a friend. And so I thought, well, I bet Tarana, I could interview her. And I started coming up with this list. And what was really interesting was when I looked at the list afterwards, none of the people that were on the list, and it was a shorter list than who eventually ended up in the book. But my short list at the time, none of them were people who, if they are the type of people who have gone to protests and put themselves in some physical peril, I didn't know about it. And they're not known for that. And I thought, well, what made it okay for me to call them activists and not me, right? Because my original thought was that was what an activist is. So that sort of blew everything open, because then I was like, oh, well, okay, so how would I define activism? And so I ended up defining activism as being led by your values to purposeful action in the hope of making the world brighter for others. And when you have that, now suddenly we can all be activists, right? Like now it's not as scary a thing to be.
Yeah.
And so I ended up interviewing this. And of course, remember, this was January 2020. So I think we signed the book deal in March of 2020. And of course, in March is when everything started like locking down for COVID. And I wrote and interviewed these people, and George Floyd got murdered and Breonna Taylor got killed. And like all of this crazy, we had, I mean, that was an election year. It was extremely volatile year. And it was a gift. It was an absolute gift to be able to write it, because while all this horrible stuff was going on, I was interviewing these people who had made it a part of their lives to change the world. And it was very hopeful. So it was a really very hopeful exercise for me to write the book. But yeah, originally it wasn't my idea, and I didn't know that I could do it. I was totally made it up as I was going along.
Well, I'm so glad that you did not delete that email, and that publisher emailed you, and that you chose those words for 2020.
Yeah, I got lucky.
It led to where you are. So I'm curious about that definition of activism. Was that something that you landed on before you started writing the book, and as you were just kind of ideating about what it might be, or did you land on that after you'd done all your interviews?
Well, I certainly came up with the idea that activism had to be broader than just protest before I started writing the book. And that was literally because I was coming up with names of people who I wanted to interview. The interviewing them helped hone that a bit, that idea a bit. Also, the way that, I mean, it's about a dozen people that I interviewed, more or less, that for the book, and they're all very, very different, with very different causes and very different backgrounds, and you know, similar yet diverse ways of viewing what joy could be and how you get joy in the work. And that was eye-opening. Like there were definitely learnings that I had during the writing of the book that I did not expect to have. And you know, I had the whole outline of the book done, and it was very similar to what we went through, as you know, in our group coaching thing. Like it was, even though our relationship wasn't about activism, a lot of what I was like playing with, and sort of the exercises and things that we were doing, were sort of things that I wanted to translate into what activism, because activism does require leadership, and it does require courage, and all the things that we were talking about in our group. And there were certain things that I know that we did, and then it ended up like, it was like, this is going to be a chapter in the book. And then interviewing people, I'm like, this isn't a chapter in the book. Like this, I need to get rid of that, right? So yeah, it was definitely as educational for me as I hope the final result is for people who read it, because it was a journey through it.
Yeah, especially in that year of 2020.
Yeah.
Incredible. So the subtitle is How to Work for Change Without Losing Your Joy. So, which implies kind of a pain point here, which is that a lot of times we do tend to lose our joy when we pour our whole selves into something. I know I've been there, where, you know, call it burnout or exhaustion or fatigue. Why is it that you think that folks, that so many of us can lose our joy when we're trying to work for change? What is it that causes that?
Well, I mean, like, let's be real. We don't get into activism because things are great, right? Like you get into activism because something has broken your heart, or something has pissed you off, or, you know, there's always going to be something that is going to bother you, right? Or often, not always. Sometimes, I mean, there are people who have gotten into it for joyful reasons, but that's a rare thing. Like usually we're fighting discrimination, or there's an environmental issue that's really ticking us off or something. So I think it is for that reason that the idea of joy being tied to activism feels incongruent, right? Like it feels like that can't possibly happen, because there's some tough stuff that's happening in this. So for me, what I think is that we have to be very clear on the definition of joy and how it differs from happiness, right? And so for me, I think, and for the purposes of what I wrote, happiness is something that happens because of some external circumstance, right? Like somebody wishes you happy birthday, or somebody bakes you cake, or somebody gives you a gift. And it can be fleeting, right? Like, it's like, that felt really good, but it's not. But joy is something that is tied to something meaner. Meatier. It's tied to your meaning and your purpose, and it's deeper. And that's really what I'm talking about here. And if you think about joy then as being tied to meaning and purpose, then you can start thinking about joy as being tied to service, or you can think about joy as being tied to making the world better. And then it doesn't seem so weird, right? That joy and activism can really coexist, and sometimes even joy can be the byproduct of activism. But the trick, of course, is being able to do it in a way that takes care of your spirit, and be able to do it in a way where you there's a lot of self-awareness that you have to do, and self inquiry that you have to do in order to be able to do it well and not burn out, right? And there's always going to be tough times, but there are ways to manage your way through it, and that's what the wisdom of the people who I interviewed led me to understand. You know?
I love that. What was your most surprising interview? I love asking this question because the word surprising can mean different things to different people. So I'm curious, when you think back about the different interviews, which one was the most surprising to you?
You know, there were several. Like I would say almost each person who I interviewed, and I interviewed each of them for a minimum of an hour, some of them longer, had something to say that made me go, wow, I had not considered it that way. So a couple that come to mind. So a very dear friend of mine, Asha Dornfest, who I interviewed for this book, and Asha she's a political activist. So she sort of became activated after the 2016 presidential election, that she decided she wanted to help galvanize her community to vote and to make a difference, and to, you know, do things like call your senators and call your representatives. And so her activism actually took place offline, which is really sort of interesting, right? Because we're on such an online world. But she galvanized thousands of people in her community to march and to sign people up to vote and really get into this. And she's a very good friend, one of my best friends, and she's very, very kind. Like, she's a very sort of soft-spoken, gentle soul. Like, you know, she's one of those people that I always tease her. Like, she's one of those people that you imagine sitting with a warm fisherman's sweater in front of a fire saying, you know, I've made you iced tea, tell me what's going on, right? Like, that's her energy,
warm,
right?
Yes.
It's just this very sweet, warm. And I asked her how she manages to stay that way. Like, she just doesn't have a harsh word to say about anybody, and be a political activist.
Yeah.
Now, right? Like how can you hold those two things at the same time, right? Like, and I expected her to say, well, it's just who I am, right? Like, I've just always been this way, and I'm the person that, you know, rescues all the puppies and or whatever, right? Like, I expected her to say that. And what surprised me was she said it's 100% mindful. And she said, and the reason is because they want us to do this. Like, that's part of how they, the people in power, want to stay in power, is for everybody to be so angry. And she goes, my kindness is me saying, I'm not buying it. Like, my activism is going to be about invitation, and tell me what you're like. She described it as inviting people to her front porch. And she says, and I may not change your mind, and you may not change my mind, but hopefully we both walk away from each other thinking a little bit bigger and wondering about something that we hadn't wondered about. And I thought she goes, kindness is 100% resistance for me, like 100%. And it never occurred to me. Like, I think I sort of, like Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. Like, I thought of it as we're going to be better than them because we're so kind, right? And it was sort of, that was what I thought kindness was about. But for Asha, it was, no. It's going to be, you can't do that to me. I refuse to go to do that. I'm going to stand my ground. And it's not about being a pushover. She says, she goes, I'm not going to let people abuse me. I'll walk away, but I'm not going to contribute to that. So that was one that was really surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was one other one, Valerie Kaur, who's a Sikh, SIKH activist. And she said something to me. She said, our march for justice is going to continue after we're gone. And it has been going on a long time. We're never going to achieve what we want, which was really depressing, but also a little freeing, right? Like, it was also like, oh, she goes, so we have to, the only way we can have longevity in the work is to access joy. Like, we have to do it. It is part of the way we keep going. And that was a really, because I remember her saying, we're never going to achieve it. And I was like, then why are we even here?
Yeah.
And she was like, because we want, that's what we do, right? Is we take the baton from the people before us and we pass it on to the people after us. And part of the way we do that is by accessing joy. And that was another one that I hadn't considered before speaking with her as well. So yeah, but there was a bunch of them. There really was.
That's exciting. Well, I can't wait to dive in. And I just got it, Amazon, the official release date is November 2nd, right?
November 2nd. Yes. But people are getting it already. So
I know. So
pre-order.
I just got it a couple days ago and can't wait to be able to dive in. I'm just so excited, Karen. And thank you for just spending hours, because I know you spent hours really diving into this and exploring these ideas and getting to know all of these stories that we can learn so much from. And I know there's a lot of people that, subscribe to this that have very differing views. And so my hope is just that we can kind of what you were saying. I love the idea of what you just shared with, I think Asha was her name, where it's like the idea of it being an invitation. Yeah. And so that's what I hope that people take away from this is, regardless of what your opinions are or where you fall on the political or theological spectrum, that we're all challenged to think bigger and have empathy for those that are in our communities and that we interact with each day. And if we're not interacting with people that are different from us, then that's a problem too. And we have work to do. So that's what I hope that people take away from our conversation in this book.
I hope so too. And it's not, and that was one thing, is I stayed away from, Asha is a political activist, but I did not want it to come across in any way that because activism tends to be thought of as a very liberal kind of thing, no matter who's in power, right? It's sort of like fight the fight. And so people in this book are from all along the spectrum of beliefs of conservative and liberal and everything else, and what they're doing. So for sure, this is about just making the world the best we can, separate from our politics, for sure.
I love it. That's what we all need right now.
Amen. For sure.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. I just can't wait to continue to cheer you on and see all of the amazing success that this book gets. So go to Amazon, order it, or your local book store, the Lightmaker's Manifesto. Thanks, Karen.
And thank you so much for your light and all that you're doing here on your own platform. You just take my breath away.
Oh, thanks, Karen.